Autumn in Cattlesgrove was different from autumn anywhere else. When the leaves began to turn and the air smelled faintly of smoke, an ominous hush would fall over the small town, as if the trees themselves were waiting. Stories had been told for years about strange sounds and figures that lurked just out of sight, always near the fields. The locals knew to avoid the cornfields once the sun began to dip, warning their children to steer clear after dark. Eliza Moore had grown up in Cattlesgrove, but even she found herself glancing over her shoulder when walking the narrow path home from her friend's house. She'd always told herself the stories were just tales to scare children, or perhaps an attempt to keep folks on their best behavior. But she felt the unease that autumn as though it were crawling under her skin, and she couldn't shake it. It was the first week of October, and the corn was tall, nearly ripe for harvest. Her father, Hank Moore, was one of the few farmers still working the old family land. Most people had moved on from farming, but Hank had a strong attachment to his plot of land, refusing to sell despite offers from a big agricultural company. Hank said he felt obligated to keep the land in the family, as his father and grandfather had done before him. One evening, while Eliza was reading in bed, she heard her father call out from downstairs. "Eliza," he shouted, a note of worry in his voice. She could hear the back door creak as he pulled it open. "Come down here. Hurry." Startled, she threw on a jacket over her pajamas and rushed downstairs. Hank was standing at the door, flashlight in hand, peering out into the inky blackness. "What is it?" she asked, rubbing her arms as a gust of cold air blew in. "There's something in the field," he said. "I saw movement. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't any animal I've ever seen." Eliza swallowed. Her father wasn't one to jump at shadows, so his worry made her heart beat faster. "Did you want me to call someone?" she asked, hoping he'd agree and let the police or a neighbor check. "No," he shook his head firmly. "If it's just some kid fooling around, I don't want to make a fuss. But I thought you should know. Don't go out there alone, all right?" She nodded, but his words stayed with her long after she returned to bed. The idea of a strange figure hiding in the cornfields unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She tried to sleep but kept hearing sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and then, something else. It was faint, almost too faint to be real, but she could have sworn she heard whispering. It was like a breeze slipping through the corn, but somehow it sounded like words, muttered low and hurried. She shivered, pulling the blanket over her head, praying for morning to come. The following day was bright, with the early morning light glinting off frost-kissed leaves. Hank seemed unperturbed, so Eliza tried to put the events of the night before out of her mind. But the whispers were there, nagging at her. They'd felt so real. That afternoon, her friend Jessica came by, and they decided to take a walk along the edge of the fields. Eliza hadn't told her about the incident, but Jessica sensed something was wrong. "You've been quiet," Jessica said, nudging her with her elbow. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, fine," Eliza mumbled, stuffing her hands into her pockets. But as they walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw only the golden stalks of corn stretching toward the horizon. They stopped by an old oak tree near the edge of the field, and as they sat, Eliza noticed a strange object tangled in the tree's roots. It was a small, carved figure, no bigger than her hand, carved out of what looked like bone. Its eyes were hollow, giving it a hauntingly empty stare. Eliza picked it up, brushing off the dirt. "Look at this," she said, showing it to Jessica. "Weird, right?" Jessica frowned, inspecting the figure. "Creepy. Maybe someone dropped it?" "Maybe," Eliza replied, but deep down, she doubted it. It seemed intentional, as though someone had placed it there to be found. Just holding it made her uneasy, and she almost threw it back into the dirt. But some instinct made her tuck it into her pocket instead. As they headed home, Jessica stopped abruptly. Did you hear that? Eliza froze. In the quiet, she could just make out the same sound she'd heard the night before, a faint whispering, like words drifting through the corn. They both turned to look at the field, and Eliza's breath caught. There, just barely visible among the tall stalks, was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but she could see it standing perfectly still, watching them. Without another word, she grabbed Jessica's hand, and they ran. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. The figure, the whispers, the carved object, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. She took the figure out of her pocket, studying it by the dim glow of her bedside lamp. It looked ancient, worn smooth by time, and she noticed strange symbols carved into its surface. She heard her father moving around downstairs and decided to join him, hoping his presence would ease her nerves. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw him staring out the window, his face pale. "Dad?" He didn't look at her, just kept staring into the night. "They're out there," he said quietly. "I saw them. More than one this time. Just standing there, watching the house." Eliza's blood ran cold. She approached the window, peering into the darkness, and her heart leaped. There, on the edge of the field, stood 3 figures. They were almost indistinguishable from the cornstalks, but their silhouettes were unmistakable, their heads turned toward the house. "What do they want?" she whispered, more to herself than to her father. Hank shook his head. "I don't know. But I'm not waiting to find out. I'll call the sheriff in the morning." The sheriff arrived at dawn, a burly man named Clayton Rogers who had known Hank for years. Eliza watched from the porch as the 2 men talked, her stomach churning with unease. Sheriff Rogers took a few steps into the field, then turned back, shaking his head. "Nothing out here now," he said, his voice carrying on the crisp morning air. "Might be pranksters, though I can't imagine who'd go to all that trouble." Eliza wanted to tell him about the whispering, about the figure she'd found, but something held her back. She didn't want him to think she was crazy. That evening, Eliza couldn't bring herself to stay indoors. She needed to know if the figures would return, if the whispers were real or just her imagination. She grabbed a flashlight and slipped outside, the chill air biting through her jacket. As she reached the edge of the cornfield, she heard them again, the whispers. They were louder now, more distinct, and she realized with horror that they were saying her name. "Eliza. Eliza." Her hands shook as she raised the flashlight, casting its beam into the field. The light caught on something pale, and she stifled a scream as a figure slowly turned to face her. Its face was wrong, almost featureless, with hollow pits where eyes should have been. Frozen in terror, she could only stare as it began to move toward her, its gait slow but deliberate. Behind it, other figures began to emerge from the corn, their empty eyes fixed on her. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. She turned and ran, her heart pounding, the figures' whispers echoing in her ears. She burst into the house, slamming the door behind her, and found her father waiting, his face drawn with fear. "They're after me," she gasped, clutching the figure in her pocket. "They know my name." Hank knew they couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, they packed up a few belongings and left, driving to a relative's house in a nearby town. But the whispers followed her, haunting her dreams, calling her back to the field. Days turned into weeks, but the terror never left. Eliza felt the pull of the cornfield like a magnet, as though something there still held a piece of her. And she knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before she would return, drawn by the whispers and the figures who waited, patiently, in the golden stalks. Here. In the small town of Tallow's End, fall had always been a special time of year. The leaves of the old maple trees blazed with colors like fire, reds and oranges and yellows glowing against the gray sky. Townsfolk would walk along the forest trails, admiring the beauty and collecting fallen leaves to press into albums. Families would carve pumpkins on their porches, and children would laugh, running through piles of leaves gathered by the town's caretaker, Old Ben. Tallow's End was a place where autumn was almost sacred, and each year, the locals gathered for the harvest festival. It was a time to celebrate the turning of the season, to honor the harvest, and to appreciate the forest that surrounded the town like a protective cocoon. But for as long as anyone could remember, there had been one rule that every resident abided by without question: never go into the woods after sunset. It was a rule that everyone followed, even though no one could explain why. Some said it was just an old tradition, a warning to keep children from wandering too far from home. But there was an unsettling feeling that drifted through Tallow's End in the fall, a prickling sense of being watched when you walked near the tree line, and whispers that seemed to drift on the wind from somewhere deep within the woods. This year, though, something felt different. The leaves turned early, the red and gold hues too bright, almost unnatural. And the air had a stillness to it that unsettled the townsfolk. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. On the night of the harvest festival, the town gathered in the main square. There was cider and roasted corn, music and laughter. The townspeople danced, children played, and Old Ben stood watch over it all, as he did every year. Ben was a quiet man, his face etched with wrinkles that seemed to have stories of their own. He'd been around since anyone could remember, always sweeping the leaves from the paths, tending to the gardens, and, most importantly, warning the children to stay away from the woods after dark. This year, however, there was one who did not heed Old Ben's warning. 16-year-old Sarah Rourke had grown up hearing tales of the woods, but she was at that age where curiosity burned hotter than caution. Sarah's mother had died when she was young, and her father worked long hours in the nearby city, leaving her with plenty of time to wonder what lay beyond the tree line. So, when the harvest festival was in full swing and the moon rose high, casting pale light over the town, Sarah slipped away from the crowd and ventured toward the woods. She glanced back over her shoulder, making sure no one saw her. She could see Old Ben near the bonfire, his gaze sharp as he scanned the crowd, but he didn't seem to notice her slipping away. The wood seemed to call to her, a low, insistent hum in her mind that she couldn't shake. She took a deep breath and stepped across the invisible line that everyone in Tallow's End knew not to cross. The silence was immediate. It was as if she'd walked into a room and shut the door on the world. The hum in her mind grew louder, a soft murmur of voices that she couldn't understand. But she wasn't afraid, she was curious. She walked deeper into the woods, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. As she ventured further, the trees grew denser, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. She told herself it was just the natural smell of the forest, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach clench. After what felt like hours, Sarah realized she was lost. She turned around, looking for a familiar landmark, but the trees all looked the same. The murmuring in her mind grew louder, the voices whispering her name, beckoning her deeper into the woods. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. She whipped around, her heart pounding, but she saw no one. The footsteps stopped, and she stood still, straining to listen. The forest was silent, as if holding its breath. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing among the trees. It was a man, tall and thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight. He wore an old-fashioned suit, his hair slicked back, and his eyes were dark, like twin voids that swallowed the light. He smiled, a slow, unnerving smile that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and cold. She stumbled back, her heart hammering. How do you know my name?" He tilted his head, his smile widening. "I know all who walk in these woods." Sarah felt a surge of panic. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the damp leaves, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The murmuring voices grew louder, overlapping, until they were a cacophony in her mind. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the man's presence, close behind her, his footsteps soft and unhurried. She burst out of the woods and stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air. The harvest festival was still in full swing, the music and laughter a sharp contrast to the terror that had gripped her in the woods. She looked back, but the man was gone. The next morning, Sarah woke to a town in mourning. Old Ben had disappeared during the night. His broom lay abandoned near the bonfire, his footprints leading to the edge of the woods and stopping abruptly. The townsfolk searched for him, but no one dared enter the woods. Over the following weeks, more people disappeared. It was as if the woods had awoken, hungry and eager to claim anyone who ventured too close. The townsfolk grew fearful, avoiding the forest at all costs. Even during the day, the trees seemed to loom, their branches reaching out like claws. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the woods was watching her, waiting. She could hear his voice in her dreams, whispering her name, calling her back to the forest. She tried to ignore it, but the pull was stronger than her fear. One night, she woke to find herself standing at the edge of the woods, the darkness stretching before her like a yawning mouth. She didn't remember how she got there, but she felt the man's presence, close and cold. She turned to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The whispers in her mind grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, until all she could hear was his voice, soft and insistent. "Come home, Sarah," he whispered. "Come to the woods." And with that, she stepped forward, disappearing into the darkness. The townsfolk searched for her, but they found no trace. Talos End mourned her loss, but they knew, deep down, that the woods had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. The rule was whispered to the children, passed down from generation to generation: never go into the woods after sunset. But the woods were patient, and each year, as the leaves turned and the air grew thick with the scent of autumn, they waited. The whispers drifted on the wind, calling to anyone who would listen, promising secrets and shadows. And as the years passed, Talos End became a town of whispers and empty places, where the woods loomed like a dark memory, and the leaves fell like blood on the ground. And every fall, on the night of the harvest festival, a figure could be seen at the edge of the woods, a pale man in an old-fashioned suit, watching, waiting, and smiling his slow, unnerving smile. Thank you for watching this video. Give it a like, subscribe, and click the bell to receive notifications for new videos.